There's a moment, you've felt it before, even if you've never stood on a battlefield, where the air itself seems to know something terrible is about to happen. The birds go quiet first, then the wind holds its breath. And if you're standing on the Great Naruto Bridge on this particular morning, half-built, fog rolling in off the water like something alive, you'd feel it too. Naruto Uzumaki felt it. He just didn't know yet that it was the sound of his whole world deciding to leave him behind. Let's rewind for a second, because if you're just joining this story, you need the full picture before the mist swallows everything. Team 7, Kakashi Hatake, Sasuke Uchiha, Sakura Haruno, and Naruto, had been sent on what was supposed to be a simple C-rank escort mission. Guard a bridge builder named Tazuna, walk him home to the land of waves, collect the pay, go back to the academy life of D-rank chores and miss naps. That was the plan. Except nothing about this mission had gone according to plan since the moment two Miss Mean ambushed them on the road, and it definitely wasn't going according to plan now, with Zabuza Momochi, the demon of the hidden mist himself, standing in the center of a bridge soaked in fog so thick you could barely see your own hands, backed by a masked figure whose blank porcelain mask hid a killing intent sharper than any kunai. If you've watched enough of these fights, you already know how dangerous Zabuza is. But knowing it and standing 3 feet from it are very different things, and for a 12-year-old genin who'd graduated the academy dead last, standing that close to a man capable of silencing an entire village with his name alone was enough to make even blood feel cold. Kakashi Hatake, Sharingan uncovered, breathing hard, chakra reserves bleeding out faster than he wanted to admit, was locked in a stare-down with Zabuza that had already cost him more than he could afford. Behind him, Sasuke was on one knee, breath ragged, a thin line of blood tracing down from his temple where one of Haku's Senbon had grazed him during the opening exchange. Sakura stood over Tazuna, kunai shaking in her hand, doing the only job she'd actually been given, protect the client, while trying not to look at how outmatched her team really was. And Naruto? Naruto was on the ground. He'd taken a hit meant for Sasuke, a full-body slam from Zabuza's blade, the flat side, thank whatever mercy existed in that moment, because the edge would have ended things then and there. He'd gone down hard, skidding across the wooden planks of the unfinished bridge, and he hadn't gotten back up. You know that feeling when you're watching something happen and some part of you is screaming get up, get up, get up, and the person just doesn't? That's what this was. Kakashi-sensei, Sakura's voice cut through the fog, thin and desperate. Naruto's not moving, I know. Kakashi didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. Zabuza's blade was resting on his shoulder in a lazy, mocking stance that said I could end this whenever I want, and we both know it. Here's the thing about Kakashi Hatake that a lot of people forget. Underneath the reputation, underneath the Sharingan, underneath the calm mask, he was still doing math. Constant, brutal math. How much chakra do I have left? How long can I hold this technique? How many of my genin can I actually protect if this goes worse than it already has? And in that math, in that split second, life or death calculation happening behind one exhausted eye, a number came back that he didn't like. Haku's Senbon were fast. Zabuza's chakra reserves, even depleted from the earlier clash with the hidden Miss Swordsman's blade techniques, were still monstrous. And Kakashi, brilliant, prodigious, copy ninja Kakashi, was running on fumes after holding the Sharingan open for this long. If you were in his position, what would you do? Genuinely, sit with that question for a second, because it's the entire hinge this story turns on. You have 3 genin. 1 is unconscious or close to it. 2 are still standing barely. Your client is unprotected. Your chakra is failing. And the enemy in front of you has not, for 1 second, stopped smiling. Kakashi made his decision the way commanders have made brutal decisions since the beginning of shinobi history, fast, cold, and without the luxury of sentiment. Sakura. Get to Tazuna. We're falling back. What? Sakura's voice cracked. Sensei, what about Naruto? There's no time. Kakashi's voice was flat in a way that told you exactly how much effort it was taking him to keep it that way. He's not combat viable. If we try to retrieve him, Zabuza gets an opening, and then none of us make it off this bridge. Sasuke, can you move? Sasuke, teeth gritted, forced himself upright. Yeah, then move. Now. Sakura's whole body was shaking. She looked at Naruto's still form, 20 feet away in the fog, and then back at her sensei, and something in her chest felt like it was tearing in half. We can't just, Kakashi-sensei, he's our teammate, Sakura. Kakashi's tone left no room for argument, and if you've ever heard an adult use that particular tone with you, you know exactly how final it sounds. That's an order. Move. And here's where the story asks you to sit in something uncomfortable, because this is the part where a lot of people watching this are going to want to reach through the screen and stop what happens next. Sakura grabbed Tazuna's arm. Sasuke, favoring his injured side, fell into formation. Kakashi threw one last unreadable glance towards Zabuza, a warning, a promise that this wasn't over, and the three of them began their retreat, back across the unfinished planks of the bridge, into the wall of fog that had swallowed half the battlefield already. Behind them, in a heap on the cold wood, 12-year-old Naruto Uzumaki lay unmoving, alone, as the sound of his team's footsteps faded into nothing. If you're new here, hit subscribe now, because trust me, you do not want to miss what happens to this kid next. The retreat wasn't clean. Nothing about a fighting withdrawal ever is. Kakashi had to burn through what little chakra he had left just holding off a final volley of Saban that Haku sent their way, covering Sakura and Tazuna's escape into the tree line at the base of the bridge. Sasuke, despite his injuries, managed a few sharp counters that bought precious seconds. By the time they reached the relative safety of the forest path leading back toward Tazuna's house, all three of them were breathing like they'd run a marathon, and none of them were talking about the fourth member of their team who wasn't with them. Sakura broke first. Of course she did. Out of the three of them, she was the one who hadn't spent years building emotional walls, the one who still let herself feel things out loud. We left him. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried. We left him there, Sakura. Kakashi didn't stop walking. Couldn't, not with Tazuna's safety still the priority, not with Zabuza and Haku still somewhere behind them in that fog. I made the only call I could make. If we'd stayed to retrieve him, all four of us could be dead right now instead of just. He stopped himself before finishing that sentence. But everyone heard the shape of the words that didn't get said. Instead of just Naruto, Sasuke said nothing. That was, in its own way, the loudest reaction of all. He kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, and if you looked closely, really closely, the way only someone who known him a while could, you might have noticed his hand was shaking slightly at his side. Not from injury. From something else. Something he wasn't ready to name. They reached Tazuna's house as the sun started burning through the last of the morning fog, and the moment the door closed behind them, the weight of what had just happened settled over the room like a physical thing. Tsunami, Tazuna's daughter, took one look at their faces and didn't ask questions. She simply moved to boil water for tea and started pulling out bandages. Because some situations don't need words to explain themselves. It was Sakura who finally said it out loud, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped so tightly around a cup of tea that her knuckles had gone white. We need to go back for him. As soon as we've regrouped. We can't just leave him out there. Sakura's right. Sasuke's voice, when it finally came, was low and controlled in a way that didn't match the storm clearly happening underneath. This isn't up for debate. Kakashi, seated with his back against the wall, one eye still covered, looked more exhausted than either of them had ever seen him. He'd used far too much chakra holding that Sharingan open. His body needed rest it wasn't going to get. I know. He closed his one visible eye. We go back. Once I have enough chakra to actually be useful in a fight instead of a liability. If we go back now, half dead, we don't rescue anyone, we just give Zabuza 3 more targets. Nobody liked that answer. But nobody had a better one either. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. How long does as soon as possible actually take, when the person saying it is running on empty? Because for Naruto, alone on that bridge, every minute that answer took to become action was a minute that mattered enormously. Now let's go back to the bridge. Let's go back to the fog. Naruto's eyes fluttered open sometime after the sound of retreating footsteps had faded into nothing but wind and creaking wood. Pain was the first thing that registered, a deep, bone-rattling ache along his ribs where Zabuza's blade had caught him, the flat side doing more damage than he wanted to admit even to himself. The second thing that registered was the silence. No Sakura yelling his name. No Sasuke's sharp voice cutting through the fog. No Kakashi's steady presence anywhere nearby. Just fog. Just cold, damp wood under his cheek. Just the distant, rhythmic sound of water against the bridge's unfinished pylons. Hey, he croaked, pushing himself up onto one elbow, wincing at the effort it took. Guys? Sakura-chan? Sasuke, you jerk, this isn't funny. Nothing answered him. Not even an echo. You know that particular kind of quiet that isn't peaceful at all. The kind that presses in on your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat? That's the quiet Naruto woke up into. He forced himself upright, one hand braced against the bridge railing, scanning the fog for any hint of orange hair or silver hair or the distinctive slouch of his teammates. There was nothing. Just white, rolling mist, and the vague outline of half-finished bridge stretching into nowhere in both directions. For a second, just a second, 12-year-old Naruto Uzumaki let himself believe the worst possible thing a kid who'd spent his whole life being left out could believe. They left me. No. He said it out loud, like saying it could make it less true. No way. Kakashi-sensei wouldn't, Sasuke wouldn't just. But even as he said it, some small, buried, painfully familiar part of him, the part that remembered every birthday spent alone, every meal eaten by himself at Ichiraku's because no one else showed up, every time the other kids in the academy had made plans that never seemed to include him, that part of him wasn't surprised at all. That part had been waiting for this exact moment his entire life, waiting to be proven right about being the kind of person people left behind when things got hard. If you've ever felt that specific, hollow certainty that you're the one people forget in a crisis, you know exactly what was happening in Naruto's chest right now. It's not a feeling. It's a conclusion your body reaches before your mind catches up to it. He tried to stand fully and immediately regretted it, pain lancing through his ribs hard enough to steal his breath. He caught himself against the railing, teeth gritted, and forced air back into his lungs one ragged breath at a time. Okay, he muttered to himself, because talking out loud was better than sitting in the silence. Okay, Naruto, think. Kakashi-sensei probably had a reason. There's gotta be a plan. They probably went to get help, right? Right. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. But the fog didn't answer, and the bridge stayed empty, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded uncomfortably like every mean whisper he'd overheard as a kid said, "No one's coming back for you. No one ever does." Here's something worth noticing. If you're paying close attention to this story, this is the exact moment everything changes. Not the moment Team 7 walked away, that was just the setup. This, right here, alone on a fog-covered bridge with a body that wouldn't stop hurting and a mind that wouldn't stop spiraling, is the moment the story actually begins. Because pain like that doesn't just sit still in a person. It has to go somewhere. And where it goes next determines everything that follows. Naruto managed to drag himself off the bridge and into the relative cover of the tree line at its base, moving with the kind of stubborn, graceless determination that had gotten him through every impossible situation the Academy had ever thrown at him. Every step sent fresh pain radiating from his ribs. His vision kept swimming at the edges, but some deep, animal instinct told him that lying exposed on an open bridge, alone, with an S-rank missing means somewhere in the vicinity, was possibly the single worst decision he could make right now. The forest floor was damp and cold under him when he finally collapsed against the base of a tree, breath coming in short, controlled gasps as he tried to keep the pain manageable. He pressed a hand against his ribs and felt something warm and wet there. Not good. Definitely not good. Come on, he muttered to himself, sliding down until he was sitting fully, back against rough bark, eyes struggling to stay open. Just gotta hold on. They'll come back. They have to come back. But the forest around him stayed silent, indifferent, fog curling between the trees like something patient and watching. Let's take a moment here, because this is important. There's a specific kind of loneliness that hits different than just being physically alone. It's the loneliness of being left, of having people who are supposed to have your back simply not be there when it mattered most. Naruto had felt echoes of that loneliness his whole life. Empty apartment, empty birthday table. Empty seats at the academy where other kids' families sat cheering. But this was different. This wasn't the ambient loneliness of a kid nobody paid attention to. This was the sharp, specific loneliness of being a teammate, someone who was supposed to matter to 3 specific people, and finding out, in the worst possible way, exactly how much he mattered when the stakes got real. His vision blurred, and this time it wasn't just from pain. He wiped at his face with the back of his hand, furious at himself for the tears that came anyway. Stupid, he hissed under his breath. Stupid, stupid, crying isn't gonna fix anything. Get it together, Naruto. But his body had other ideas. Blood loss, exhaustion, and the crushing emotional weight of the last hour combined into something his 12-year-old frame simply couldn't fight off anymore. His eyelids grew heavier. The edges of his vision darkened. The last thing he registered before consciousness slipped away entirely was the sound of the fog seeming to shift somewhere nearby, a soft displacement of air that could have been wind, or could have been something else entirely. He didn't get the chance to find out which. Darkness took him first. Time does strange things when you're unconscious. It stretches and compresses in ways that don't make sense until you wake up and try to piece together how long you were actually gone. For Naruto, it might have been an hour. It might have been longer. The fog doesn't keep a calendar. What he became aware of first was warmth. That was strange, because the last thing he remembered was the cold, damp forest floor and the ache in his ribs pulling him under. Now there was something soft beneath him, and a strange, herbal smell in the air, faintly bitter, like steeped medicinal leaves. His eyes cracked open slowly, vision swimming before resolving into unfamiliar wooden beams overhead. A ceiling. Not the forest. Not the bridge. Where? He tried to sit up and immediately felt a firm hand press against his shoulder, easing him back down with surprising gentleness for how strong the grip felt underneath it. Don't. You'll open the wound again. The voice was low, rough, and entirely unfamiliar, an older man's voice, weathered like old leather, carrying the particular flatness of someone who didn't waste words on people he didn't know well yet. Naruto's head turned toward the sound, and his eyes landed on a figure seated beside the bed he was lying in. The man looked to be somewhere in his 50s, maybe older. It was hard to tell, given how much weather and hard living seemed etched into his face. Gray-streaked hair pulled back in a loose knot. A weathered, scarred face that had clearly seen more than its share of violence over the years. He wore simple, practical clothes, a plain dark tunic with long sleeves, sturdy trousers, nothing that marked him as anything in particular. No headband. No visible clan symbol. Just a man who looked like he belonged to the forest more than to any village. But his eyes, sharp, assessing, missing absolutely nothing, those were not the eyes of an ordinary civilian. Naruto had spent enough time around shinobi over the past few weeks to recognize that particular quality of stillness, the kind that came from years of being ready for violence at a moment's notice. Naruto's throat was dry, his voice cracking. Who are you? Where am I? You're in my home. The man's tone gave nothing away. About 2 kilometers from where I found you bleeding out under a tree like an idiot. As for who I am, a pause, brief and considering, like he was weighing how much a stranger deserved to know. You can call me Renji. Naruto blinked, processing that. His body still ached everywhere, but the sharp, dangerous edge of the pain had dulled. Whatever this man had done to treat his wounds, it had clearly worked. He glanced down and saw clean bandages wrapped tightly around his ribs, the blood-stained remains of his jacket folded neatly on a chair nearby. You patched me up? Would you have preferred I left you there? Renji's expression didn't shift, but there was something almost dry in the way he said it. Your ribs were cracked, not broken, small mercy. Whoever hit you pulled the strike. If they hadn't, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Whoever hit you. The memory came rushing back all at once. The bridge, the fog, Zabuza's blade slamming into his side, the sound of his team's footsteps fading into nothing. Naruto's chest tightened, and this time it had nothing to do with his cracked ribs. My team, he said, sitting up despite the protest from his side, urgency cutting through the residual grogginess. I need to find my team. There's a fight, a bridge, they're probably still. Sit down. Renji's voice sharpened just enough to carry real command behind it, and something in Naruto's body responded to that tone before his mind caught up, settling him back against the bedding almost on instinct. You're in no condition to be running anywhere. And from what I saw when I found you, your team already made their choice about where they were running to. It wasn't back toward you. The words landed like a physical blow, somehow worse than the one that had cracked his ribs in the first place. That's not, Naruto's voice cracked, and he hated how young it sounded. They wouldn't just leave me. Kakashi-sensei wouldn't. I watched 3 shinobi retreat off that bridge and not one of them so much as glanced back toward where you were lying. Renji's tone wasn't cruel. If anything, there was something almost clinical about how flatly he stated it, like a man reporting facts rather than delivering a wound. Maybe they had a good reason, maybe they didn't. I don't know your team, kid, and it's not my business to guess at their intentions. But I know what I saw, and what I saw was you, alone, bleeding, in the middle of a war zone that had nothing to do with you finding your way home. Naruto sat there, in a stranger's home, wrapped in unfamiliar bandages, and felt something inside his chest crack in a way that had nothing to do with his ribs at all. He wanted to argue. He wanted to insist that there was an explanation, that Kakashi-sensei had a plan, that Sakura and Sasuke were probably worried sick and coming back for him right now. He wanted to believe every single one of those things with the same stubborn conviction he brought to everything else in his life. But some small, exhausted, honest part of him, the part that had spent 12 years learning exactly how it felt to be the person nobody came back for, just believed the stranger instead. Why'd you help me? Naruto asked instead, quieter now, some of the fight draining out of his voice. You don't know me. Could have just left me there. Renji was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression Naruto couldn't quite read, something that flickered between curiosity and old, buried memory. Because, Renji said finally, standing and moving toward a small wooden shelf lined with jars and pouches, his back to Naruto now, when I checked your condition, before treating the wound, I did what any competent medic would do. I checked your chakra. Something in his tone shifted. Naruto sat up a little straighter, ignoring the twinge in his ribs. And, Renji turned back around, and for the first time since Naruto had woken up, something like genuine interest showed through the weathered stillness of his expression. And in 30 years of walking this world, kid, I've felt reserves like yours exactly twice before. Both times, it ended badly for everyone involved. He crossed his arms, studying Naruto like he was reassessing something important. So you're going to forgive me if I have some questions about who exactly you are, and what exactly is living inside you. The room went very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the trees surrounding the cabin, wind stirred through the branches, and the last remnants of the morning's fog began, slowly, to burn away under a sun that Naruto, alone, injured, and abandoned on a battlefield just hours ago, was suddenly no longer sure he was viewing the same way he had before. Because somewhere on a bridge 2 kilometers away, his team believed they'd left a hopeless case behind. They had no idea what they'd actually left in that fog. And by the time they found out, it would already be far, far too late to go back to the way things used to be. What's living inside me? Naruto repeated the words slowly, like they didn't quite fit together right. What are you talking about, old man? Renji didn't answer right away. He moved instead toward a small clay pot simmering over a low fire in the corner of the cabin, ladling out something dark and herbal-smelling into a wooden cup. The whole cabin, Naruto was noticing now that his head had cleared enough to actually look around, was small but meticulously kept. Shelves of labeled jars, a low table scarred with age, a single window letting in thin morning light. Everything had the feel of a place lived in by someone who valued order because chaos had cost him too much once. Drink this, Renji said, pressing the cup into Naruto's hands without further explanation. It'll help with the pain, and it'll help me get a straight answer out of you instead of a scared 12-year-old's deflections. Naruto eyed the cup with deep suspicion. What is it? Willow bark and a few things that would take longer to explain than they're worth. It's tea, kid. Not poison. If I wanted you dead, I had an easier window for that already. Renji settled back into the chair beside the bed, arms crossed. Drink. Naruto drank. It was bitter and warm, and against his will, he felt some of the ragged tension in his shoulders start to loosen almost immediately. Now, Renji said, once Naruto had lowered the cup. Let's try this again. What's your name? Naruto. Naruto Uzumaki. Something flickered behind Renji's eyes at the surname. Brief, almost too fast to catch, but Naruto caught it anyway. He'd spent his whole life learning to notice the exact moment adults' faces changed when they heard his name, even if he rarely understood why. Uzumaki, Renji repeated, quiet, almost to himself. He didn't elaborate. Instead, and you're a Konoha shinobi. Genin, by the look of that headband. Yeah. Team 7. Naruto's jaw tightened at the reminder. Kakashi-sensei, Sakura, Sasuke, and me. The team that left you bleeding out on a bridge. It wasn't a question, and it landed with the same flat weight it had the first time. Naruto's hands curled into fists against the blanket. They didn't leave me, he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried an hour earlier. They probably had a plan. Kakashi-sensei always has a plan, sure. Renji's tone wasn't mocking, exactly, but it wasn't gentle either. And how's that plan working out for you right now? Naruto didn't have an answer for that. He looked down at the tea in his hands instead, watching steam curl off the surface, and for a moment the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the low fire. Here's something worth pausing on, because it's easy to miss if you're moving too fast through this story. Notice how Naruto keeps defending them. Notice how, even lying in a stranger's cabin with cracked ribs from a mission his team walked away from, some part of him is still building excuses on their behalf. If you've ever done that for someone, made up reasons for people who hurt you because the alternative felt too painful to sit with, you already understand exactly what's happening in this kid's chest right now. Renji seemed to understand it too. He let the silence sit for a beat longer before changing tack. Your chakra, he said instead, steering back to where the conversation had stalled before. When I checked your condition, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time. Something dense. Layered, like there's more than one signature living in that body of yours. He watched Naruto's face carefully. Does that mean anything to you? Naruto's throat went dry. He knew, of course. Everyone in Konoha his age had grown up with whispered rumors, half-understood fragments passed between kids who didn't fully know what they were repeating. Demon, child, monster, the thing sealed away. He'd spent years piecing together the truth in fragments. The villagers' stares, the way some adults flinched around him, the isolation that never quite made sense until it did. He hesitated. Trusting a stranger with this felt dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. But something about Renji's steady, unbothered expression made the words come easier than he expected. There's a fox sealed inside me. The Nine Tails. It attacked my village the night I was born, and the fourth Hokage sealed it into me instead of killing it. He braced for the reaction. The flinch. The subtle recoil that usually followed a confession like that, even from adults who should have known better. It didn't come. Renji just nodded slowly, like Naruto had confirmed something he'd already half suspected. That explains the density, then. A tailed beast seal would do that. He said it the way someone might discuss the weather, matter of fact, unbothered, entirely without the horror Naruto had learned to expect. Doesn't explain everything, though. What do you mean? I mean the fox explains why your reserves are enormous. It doesn't explain why your chakra quality is what it is underneath that. That's something else. Something in your blood, not just what was sealed into it. Renji studied him a moment longer, something calculating behind the assessment. Your surname. Uzumaki. You know anything about it? Naruto blinked. Just that it's my mom's name, I think. I don't. I never really knew my parents. Renji leaned back, and for the first time, something like genuine thought crossed his weathered features. The look of a man deciding how much of his own history he was willing to hand over to a stranger. There used to be a village. Yuzushio-gakure. The hidden whirlpool. Fell a long time ago, before you were born, in a war most people your age have never even heard of. The Uzumaki clan built it. They were known for two things: chakra reserves that put most shinobi to shame, and fuinjutsu skill that rivaled entire villages' worth of specialists rolled into single bloodlines. He nodded toward Naruto, at the bandages, at the boy sitting in his bed with a chakra signature dense enough to make an old, retired shinobi sit up and take notice. I'd wager good money you're the last of something most of the world thinks is already extinct. Naruto sat with that for a long moment, turning the words over. A clan. A whole village, gone before he was even born. Somewhere in his chest, something twisted, not quite grief, Because you can't grieve what you never knew you had, but something adjacent to it. A hollow ache for a history he never been told existed. Why didn't anyone tell me any of this? His voice came out smaller than he wanted it to. Renji's expression didn't soften exactly, but something in it shifted, old, weathered sympathy that had clearly been earned through hard experience of its own. Kid, in my experience, villages are very good at deciding what orphans deserve to know about themselves. Rarely for good reasons. He stood, moving back toward the shelf of jars, effectively ending that particular thread of conversation. Finish your tea. You need rest before we talk about anything else. Let's leave Naruto processing all of that for a moment and check in on something happening about 2 kilometers away. Because while all this was unfolding in a hidden cabin in the woods, Team 7 wasn't just sitting still. Kakashi had rested exactly as long as his body forced him to and not a minute longer. By early afternoon, chakra reserve still dangerously low but stable enough to function, he'd gathered Sasuke and Sakura and made the trek back toward the bridge. Not to fight, not yet, but to search. What they found waiting for them was not what any of them wanted to see. The bridge was empty. No Zabuza. No Haku. And no Naruto, either, just an unsettling quiet where a battlefield had been hours earlier, fog long since burned off by the midday sun, leaving nothing but bare wooden planks and the faint, dark stain of blood where a 12-year-old boy had gone down under a swordsman's blade. Sakura found it first. She stood frozen over the spot, hand pressed against her mouth, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all. That's a lot of blood, Sasuke said finally, voice flat in the particular way that meant he was working very hard to keep it that way. Kakashi crouched down, examining the stain, the scuff marks on the wood, the faint drag pattern leading off toward the tree line at the bridge's edge. Years of tracking experience read the scene in seconds, and none of what it told him was good. Someone moved him, he said quietly. After we left. There's a drag trail here, see the pattern? Someone pulled him off the bridge, toward the forest. Someone. Sakura's voice cracked. You mean Zabuza? Or that masked kid? They could have. She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone standing on that bridge understood exactly what she was too afraid to say out loud. Kakashi stood, jaw tight beneath his mask, eyes scanning the tree line with a focus that had nothing to do with looking for an active threat, and everything to do with looking for a body. We searched the surrounding area. Now, they searched for hours. Through damp forest floor and dense underbrush, calling Naruto's name until their voices went hoarse, finding absolutely nothing except more evidence that something, or someone, had moved through the area recently and left almost no trace behind. Whatever Renji had done to cover his tracks carrying an injured 12-year-old back to his hidden cabin, he'd done it well. Years of living unnoticed in these woods had made him very, very good at not being found by people who came looking. By the time the sun started sinking toward the horizon, Sakura had stopped calling Naruto's name, and started simply crying quietly as she walked, and even Sasuke's carefully maintained composure had started to crack at the edges. We have to keep looking, Sakura said, wiping furiously at her face. He could still be out here somewhere, he could be hurt, he could, Sakura. Kakashi's voice was gentler than it had been all day, which somehow made it worse. It's getting dark. We're not equipped to keep searching through the night, and if Zabuza's team is still in the area, staying out here after dark puts all of us at risk. So we're just supposed to give up. We're not giving up. Kakashi crouched down to her eye level, something he rarely did, and for a moment the exhaustion and grief on his own face was impossible to hide behind the mask. We're regrouping. We'll come back at first light with a clearer head and a real plan. I promise you, Sakura, we are not abandoning him twice. Twice. The word hung in the air, heavy with everything none of them had said out loud yet, the acknowledgement, finally, of what their retreat that morning had actually cost. Sasuke said nothing the entire walk back to Tazuna's house. But that night, long after Sakura had cried herself into an exhausted, fitful sleep and Kakashi sat alone by the window running through chakra control exercises he didn't need in order to keep his hands from shaking, Sasuke stood outside on the porch, staring out into the darkness of the forest, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, allowed himself to consider a thought he usually kept locked far away. What if he's dead? What if the dead last idiot who never stopped pushing me to get better is actually gone, and it's because we left him there? He didn't have an answer for that thought. He wasn't sure he wanted one. Back in the cabin, the tea had done its work, and Naruto had drifted into a heavy, dreamless sleep sometime in the late afternoon. When he woke again, evening light was slanting gold through the single window, and Renji was seated at the low table, sharpening a plain, unmarked kunai with slow, practiced strokes. "You're awake." Renji didn't look up. "Good. There's food if you're hungry." "Nothing fancy." Naruto sat up slowly, testing the ache in his ribs, and found it considerably more manageable than it had been that morning. Whatever was in Renji's medicine, it worked fast. He made his way, a little unsteady, to the low table, where a simple bowl of rice and grilled fish sat waiting, along with a cup of plain, hot barley tea. "Thanks," Naruto mumbled, settling down across from Renji, and eating with the particular hunger of someone whose body had spent the day repairing serious damage. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either, the silence of two people still figuring out how much space to give each other. "I went out earlier," Renji said eventually, setting down the kunai he'd been sharpening. "While you were asleep. Wanted to see if your team came back looking." Naruto's chopsticks stopped halfway to his mouth. "Did they?" "They did." Renji's expression gave nothing away. "Searched the bridge, searched the tree line for hours. Found the blood, found some drag marks I didn't cover quite as well as I thought I had. Called your name until it got too dark to keep looking safely." Something in Naruto's chest loosened, just slightly, at that. "They came back. They looked. They didn't just leave and forget about it. So they're gonna keep looking tomorrow, right?" he said, some of the old eagerness creeping back into his voice. "I should go find them, let them know I'm okay." "You could." Renji's tone was carefully neutral. "Or you could stay here and actually let your body finish healing instead of running off half-recovered to reassure people who left you unconscious on a battlefield hours ago." Naruto's jaw tightened. "It's not like that. Kakashi-sensei had to make a call and—" "Kid." Renji set down his cup with deliberate care. "I'm not trying to poison you against your team. What happened on that bridge, what led to that decision, none of that is my business, and I wasn't there for the whole fight, so I don't know all the factors your sensei was weighing. Maybe it really was the only call he could make. Maybe it wasn't. That's between you and them." He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, something sharper and more serious came into his voice. "But here's what is my business right now, because you're currently sitting in my home eating my food. You have chakra reserves and a bloodline most shinobi would spend their entire lives training to even come close to, and from what I've seen so far, absolutely nobody has ever actually taught you how to use any of it properly." Naruto blinked. "What do you mean?" "I know jutsu. I learned the academy stuff, and you've got raw power and academy-level technique, which is a little like handing someone a sword forged from the finest steel in the world and teaching them to hold it like a broom." Renji's voice carried real conviction now, the flat neutrality of earlier giving way to something almost intense. "I watched your chakra when I treated your wounds, Naruto. It's a mess. Untrained, undisciplined, leaking out in every direction because nobody ever bothered to teach you real control. That's not an insult, it's a diagnosis. And it's fixable." Naruto sat very still, absorbing that. Nobody had ever spoken to him quite like this before, not with the exasperated dismissal of his academy instructors, who'd written him off as a lost cause somewhere around his third year. Not with Kakashi's careful, measured, faintly distant guidance that always seemed to prioritize Sasuke's growth first. This was something else entirely. This was someone looking directly at his failures and treating them not as a verdict, but as a problem with a solution. "You're saying you could teach me," Naruto said slowly. "I'm saying I could teach you." Renji's eyes didn't waver. "But I want to be very clear about what that means, because I'm not interested in half measures, and I'm definitely not interested in training someone who's going to quit the moment it stops being fun." He held up a hand before Naruto could respond. "Real training. Not academy busywork. Chakra control exercises that'll make your legs shake by the end of the first week. Taijutsu drilled until your body does it without thinking. Theory you actually have to sit down and understand instead of memorizing enough to pass a test. It will be hard, And it will hurt, and there will be days you want to quit. I won't stop you if you decide you do. But I also won't go easy on you just because you're 12 and scared and your team left you bleeding on a bridge this morning. The words hung in the small cabin, heavy with everything they implied. Why? Naruto asked, and this time his voice was quieter, more genuinely searching than it had been all day. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. Renji was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, something old and painful moved behind his eyes, the shape of a memory he clearly didn't enjoy revisiting. Because a long time ago, I watched a village full of people with exactly your kind of bloodline get wiped off the map, he said, voice rougher than before. Yuzushiogakure. I told you it fell in a war most people your age have never heard of. What I didn't tell you is that I was there. Not a resident. I was allied with them, back when my own clan still existed, back before we fell too, in a different war for different reasons that don't matter right now. He exhaled slowly. I've spent 30 years alone in these woods because I got tired of watching things I cared about get destroyed by forces bigger than any one person could stop. And then this morning, I find an Uzumaki kid, the first one I've seen alive in decades, bleeding out on a bridge because the people who were supposed to protect him decided he wasn't worth the risk of saving. He met Naruto's eyes directly, and there was nothing soft in his expression now, just hard, weathered conviction. Call it a debt to people who are gone. Call it me being an old fool who can't stand watching history repeat itself. I don't fully know myself, but I know that if I let you walk back into that village tomorrow the same untrained, undisciplined kid you are right now, whatever's coming for you next, and something is always coming, kid, that's just how this life works. It's going to find you exactly as unprepared as you were on that bridge this morning. Naruto sat with that for a long, long moment. Outside, the last light of evening was fading into full dark, and somewhere in the forest, an owl called out into the growing quiet. If I train with you, he said slowly, what happens to my team? To the mission? I can't just disappear. You won't disappear forever. This isn't about running away from your life, Naruto. It's about making sure that when you walk back into it, you're not the same kid who got left behind. Renji stood, moving to bank the fire for the night, his tone shifting back towards something more businesslike. We'll figure out the logistics. For now, you need rest, and I need to think through exactly how bad the damage really is that we're working with. Naruto watched him move around the small cabin, methodically preparing for the night, and felt something shift in his chest, something that had been cracked wide open that morning on the bridge, slowly, carefully, starting to reform into something new. Okay, he said finally, quiet but certain. Teach me. Whatever it takes. Renji paused at that, glancing back at him with something almost like approval flickering across his weathered features. Good. He turned back to the fire. Then get some sleep. Tomorrow, we start finding out exactly what you're capable of. Later that night, long after Renji had fallen into the light, alert sleep of someone who'd spent decades needing to wake at the slightest sound, Naruto lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, staring up at the wooden beams overhead, replaying the entire impossible day in his mind. He thought about the bridge. About the sound of retreating footsteps fading into fog. About the particular, specific ache of being the one left behind, again, in a life that had handed him more than his fair share of that exact feeling. But he also thought about Renji's words. Your chakra's a mess, and that's fixable. And something about that framing settled differently in his chest than every dismissal he'd absorbed over 12 years of being told, one way or another, that he simply wasn't good enough. Fixable. Not hopeless. Not a lost cause. Just untrained. Just a problem waiting for the right person to actually sit down and solve it with him instead of writing him off before they'd even tried. Somewhere out there, his team was searching for him, mourning him, maybe even blaming themselves. He'd go back to them eventually. He was certain of that much, whatever complicated feelings tangled up the certainty. But for now, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, Naruto Uzumaki closed his eyes not with the familiar ache of being overlooked, but with something dangerously close to hope. Somewhere in these quiet woods, a door had opened that he hadn't even known existed that morning. And whatever waited on the other side of it, he was determined to walk through. Morning in the forest came slow and gray, mist still clinging low to the ground the way it seemed to do most mornings in this part of the world. Naruto woke to the sound of the cabin door opening, cold air rushing in, and Renji's voice cutting through his half-asleep haze like a splash of ice water. Up. Now, Naruto groaned, pulling the thin blanket over his head. It's not even light out yet. It's light enough. Renji's footsteps crossed the small cabin, and a moment later the blanket was yanked away entirely, leaving Naruto blinking up at a face that showed absolutely no sympathy for his protests. You said whatever it takes last night. I'm taking you at your word. Get up, get dressed, and meet me outside. You've got 60 seconds before I start without you. That was how Naruto learned, on his very first morning of real training, that Renji did not make idle threats. He staggered outside eventually, maybe 70 seconds later, not that anyone was counting except apparently Renji, who gave him a flat, unimpressed look for the extra 10. Into a small clearing behind the cabin that Naruto hadn't noticed the night before. It was modest, maybe 30 feet across, ringed by tall trees, with a narrow stream cutting along one edge. Ordinary at a glance, Naruto would come to know every square foot of it intimately over the following weeks. First things first, Renji said, arms crossed, studying Naruto with the same clinical assessment he'd used the day before while checking his wounds. Before we start fixing anything, I need to see exactly what we're working with. So, show me your basics. Academy Taijutsu stance. Then walk me through your chakra control exercises. Whatever you were taught, however sloppy it is. Naruto squared his shoulders, some of his old confidence flaring up despite the early hour and the ache still lingering in his ribs. Easy. Watch this. He dropped into what he remembered as the Academy's standard taijutsu stance and threw a series of basic punches and blocks. The same combination he'd drilled 100 times back in Konoha under instructors who'd mostly stopped paying attention to him somewhere around his second year. He finished with something that was supposed to resemble a clean pivot kick and instead wobbled slightly on the landing. He turned back to Renji, expecting, he wasn't sure what. Some acknowledgement, maybe? A little surprised that the class dead last wasn't completely hopeless. What he got instead was a long, considering silence, and then, that's genuinely worse than I expected. Naruto's face fell. Hey, I'm not trying to be cruel, kid. I'm being honest, because being honest with you is the only way this actually works. Renji stepped forward, circling him slowly, the way you might inspect a piece of furniture you were deciding whether to repair or replace entirely. Your weight distribution is wrong on every strike. You're throwing punches from your shoulder instead of rotating through your hips, which means you're leaving maybe 40% of your actual power on the table every single time you throw one. Your stance is too narrow, one good sweep and you'd be on the ground before you knew what happened. And that pivot kick at the end? You telegraphed it a full second before you threw it. Anyone with basic combat experience would have seen it coming and put you on your back. Naruto's jaw tightened, old defensive instincts flaring up hot and fast. The Academy taught us this. Everyone learns it this way. Then the Academy is teaching an entire generation of genin to fight like they're auditioning for a performance instead of preparing to survive real combat. Renji's tone didn't soften, but there was something almost sympathetic underneath the bluntness. The recognition of a kid who'd clearly absorbed criticism as attacks his whole life, and needed, for once, to understand this wasn't that. This isn't about you being bad at this, Naruto. It's about nobody ever actually teaching you properly. There's a difference, and it matters more than you think. If you've ever had someone finally explain to you, clearly and without judgment, why something you'd always struggled with wasn't actually your fault, you know exactly the strange, disorienting relief that flickered across Naruto's face in that moment. It didn't erase years of feeling like the class failure, but it cracked the foundation of that belief, just slightly, for the first time in a long while. Okay, Naruto said slowly. So what do I do instead? We rebuild it. From the ground up. Renji stepped back, gesturing for Naruto to reset his stance. Wider base. Weight centered, not leaning forward like you're about to fall on your face. Rotate through your hips on every strike. The power doesn't come from your arm, it comes from your entire body moving as one unit. They spent the next hour on stance alone. Just stance. No strikes, no combinations, just Renji circling him relentlessly, correcting the angle of his feet, the bend in his knees, the position of his hands. over and over until Naruto's legs burned from holding the same position through countless small adjustments. "This is boring," Naruto finally muttered, sweat dripping down his temple despite the cool morning air. "Good." Renji didn't look up from adjusting the angle of Naruto's back foot. "Boring means you're building something real instead of something flashy that falls apart the first time someone actually pushes back on it. Every shinobi who's ever impressed you with something spectacular spent years doing something exactly this boring first. Nobody skips this part. Not even prodigies." By mid-morning, Renji finally moved them on from stance work, though moved on turned out to mean something considerably worse than Naruto had hoped. "Chakra control," Renji said, leading Naruto toward the narrow stream at the clearing's edge. "Show me what you know." Naruto brightened slightly at that, some confidence returning. This, at least, he'd actually managed reasonably well before. Tree walking had been one of the few things he'd picked up fast during their early training with Kakashi, back before the mission had even started. He walked to the nearest tree, focused his chakra to his feet the way he'd practiced, and started up the trunk at a confident jog. He made it about 8 feet before the chakra beneath his feet sputtered unevenly, and he pitched backward off the trunk entirely, landing hard on his back in the damp grass with a graceless thud. "Ow!" He lay there a moment, staring up at the canopy of leaves overhead, mortification burning hotter than the fall itself. "Okay, I swear I had this down." "You had it down well enough to fool an instructor who wasn't paying close attention, and a teammate who was probably too busy being impressed by himself to actually watch your form." Renji's voice carried no mockery, just the same flat assessment as before. "What you actually have is inconsistent control that works when you're relaxed and confident, and falls apart the second your focus wavers or your chakra reserves fluctuate even slightly. In an actual fight, under real pressure, real exhaustion, real fear, that inconsistency will get you killed." Naruto pushed himself upright, rubbing at the back of his head, some of the earlier optimism draining out of him. "So what, I have to relearn tree walking too?" "You have to learn it properly this time, yes. Not memorize a feeling that works under ideal conditions. Understand exactly how much chakra you're releasing, refine your control until it's consistent regardless of your emotional or physical state, and build the kind of discipline that holds up when everything around you is falling apart." Renji nodded toward the tree. "Again. And this time, I want you to actually think about what you're doing instead of just doing it and hoping it works." Naruto tried again. And again. And again after that. "Let's be honest about something, because this story isn't interesting if we pretend it was easy. Watching someone train is nowhere near as dramatic as watching someone fight. There's no flashy jutsu here, no dramatic clash of wills against a powerful enemy. Just a 12-year-old boy running up a tree trunk, over and over, failing, adjusting, failing slightly less, failing again, while an old man with sharp eyes and very little patience for excuses corrected the smallest details of his form each time." By early afternoon, Naruto had made it maybe 30 feet up the trunk with genuinely consistent control, real progress, the kind that came from hours of unglamorous repetition rather than any flash of natural talent. His legs were shaking. His chakra reserves, enormous as they were, felt more depleted than they had any right to after a morning of what looked, from the outside, like fairly modest exertion. "That's chakra control for you," Renji said, watching him collapse against the base of the tree, breathing hard. "Doesn't matter how much raw chakra you're sitting on if you can't regulate the flow precisely. In fact, kids with your kind of reserves usually struggle with control worse than average, not better. Too much raw material to work with makes fine adjustment harder, not easier." "Great," Naruto muttered between breaths. "So my biggest strength is also my biggest problem." "Cool. Awesome. It's a problem you can fix. That's the important part." Renji settled down across from him, tossing over a water skin. "Drink. We're not done for the day, but you've earned a break." Naruto drank gratefully, and for a while they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the stream nearby and birds somewhere overhead. It was the first genuinely peaceful moment Naruto had experienced since the bridge. No fighting, no fear, just the quiet, satisfying exhaustion of a body that had actually worked hard at something and had something concrete to show for it, even if that something was just 30 feet of tree trunk and legs that wouldn't stop shaking. "Can I ask you something?" Naruto said eventually. "You can ask. No promises I'll answer." Earlier, you said Yuzushiogakure fell in a war? And your clan fell in a different one. Naruto hesitated, unsure if this was the kind of question that would get him another wall of silence. What happened? To your clan, I mean. Renji was quiet for a long moment, gazing out toward the stream, something distant and old moving behind his expression. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual flatness. We were called the Amatsu. Small clan, never more than a few dozen active shinobi at any given time, allied loosely with several of the smaller hidden villages instead of belonging to one ourselves. We specialized in a particular style of chakra manipulation, tied closely to elemental affinity work. Good people, mostly. Not perfect. But good. He paused. There was a conflict. Doesn't matter which one, there've been enough of them over the years that the details blur together after a while. We backed the wrong side, or the right side lost, depending on how you want to frame it. Either way, by the time the dust settled, there weren't enough of us left to call ourselves a clan anymore. Just scattered survivors, mostly old by that point, trying to figure out what came next. And you ended up here. I ended up here. Renji's voice carried something worn and resigned, the tone of a story told many times before, mostly to himself, in the quiet of an empty cabin. Wave Country doesn't ask questions of strangers who mind their own business and don't cause trouble. It's a good place to disappear, if disappearing is what you're after. Naruto studied him for a moment, something in his chest aching in a way that had nothing to do with his exhausted muscles. That sounds lonely. Something almost like a dry, humorless smile crossed Renji's weathered face. It was. Is some days. But loneliness is survivable, kid. Getting people killed because you weren't strong enough to protect them isn't something you get to walk away from quite as easily. His eyes sharpened, refocusing on Naruto with sudden intensity. Which is exactly why we're doing this. Understand? I'm not training you because I think it'll be fun to watch you improve. I'm training you because the alternative, sending you back into a world this dangerous with the fundamentals you walked in here with, isn't something I'm willing to have on my conscience a second time. The weight of that statement settled heavy in the clearing, and for a moment, Naruto didn't know what to say to it. So instead, he just nodded, quiet and serious in a way that was uncharacteristic for him, and let the silence hold. Okay, he said finally. Then let's keep going. Let's check back in on Team 7 for a moment. Because while Naruto was rebuilding his fundamentals one exhausting hour at a time, things back at Tezuna's house were not going smoothly at all. The second day of searching had turned up exactly as much as the first. Nothing. No sign of Naruto, no sign of the blood trail beyond where it had vanished into the tree line, and worse, a growing sense among all three remaining members of Team 7 that whatever hope they'd been clinging to was starting to feel increasingly unrealistic. Maybe we're looking in the wrong place, Sakura said that evening, slumped at the kitchen table, dark circles forming under her eyes from 2 nights of poor sleep. Maybe Zabuza's team took him somewhere else. Maybe, Sakura. Kakashi's voice was gentle but tired, the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent 2 full days holding a genin team together while privately unraveling with guilt. We've combed every inch of accessible forest within a 2-kilometer radius. If Zabuza's team had taken him as a hostage or worse, we'd expect some kind of message, some kind of demand by now. The silence isn't consistent with that. So what does it mean then? Sasuke's voice cut in, sharper than usual, the strain of the past 2 days finally showing cracks in his usual composure. Just say it, Kakashi. You think he's dead somewhere out there, and we're never going to find the body. Kakashi didn't answer immediately, and that silence said more than words could have. We don't know that, he said eventually, though even he seemed to hear how hollow it sounded. But we do need to consider that continuing to search without additional resources isn't sustainable. Zabuza's still out there. Gato's men are still a threat to this village, and if we spend all our remaining strength searching instead of preparing for the fight that's still coming, we risk failing this mission entirely, on top of everything else. Sakura's head snapped up, eyes flashing with something close to anger. You want to just stop looking? I want to be strategic about how we look, while also making sure we're not so depleted that Zabuza kills the rest of us when he inevitably comes back to finish what he started. Kakashi rubbed a hand over his masked face, and for just a moment the calm, composed Jonin facade slipped enough to show real, raw exhaustion underneath. I don't like this any more than you do, Sakura, but I have to think about all of you, not just. He stopped himself before finishing that thought, but everyone in the room understood the shape of it anyway. Not just Naruto. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable, broken only when Tezuna's grandson Inari, who'd been listening quietly from the doorway, finally spoke up in a small, hesitant voice. Was he your friend? The one who's missing? Sakura's face crumpled at the question, and she nodded, unable to trust her voice. Inari considered that for a moment, young face troubled in a way that seemed older than his years given everything this village had already suffered under Gato's rule. My dad used to say, the ocean doesn't give people back easily. But sometimes it does. You just have to keep believing it, even when it feels stupid to. It wasn't much comfort, coming from an 8-year-old boy who'd lost his own reasons to believe in much of anything a long time ago. But something about the simple, earnest honesty of it settled slightly easier in the room than anything the adults had managed to offer each other so far. That night, long after Sakura and Inari had both gone to bed, Sasuke found himself once again standing on the porch, staring out into the dark tree line, unable to shake a restless, gnawing feeling in his chest. He thought about every time he dismissed Naruto over the past few weeks, every eye roll, every sharp comment about the dead last idiot who couldn't do anything right. He thought about the strange, persistent way Naruto had kept pushing regardless, kept training, kept showing up every single day with the same stubborn, irritating determination. No matter how many times Sasuke made it clear he didn't think much of it, he never gave up on anything, Sasuke thought, staring into the dark. Not once. Not even when it would have been easier to. He didn't have a name for the feeling twisting in his chest as he thought about that, somewhere between guilt and grudging respect and something that felt uncomfortably close to grief. But it sat there anyway, heavy and unwelcome, refusing to leave him alone. Back in Renji's clearing, the second half of Naruto's first full day of training had shifted from physical exhaustion into something quieter and more introspective. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, Renji called an end to the day's physical drills and instead settled Naruto down at the low table inside the cabin, pulling out a stack of worn, hand-copied scrolls covered in dense, careful handwriting. Theory time, he said, sliding one of the scrolls across the table. You can't build real strength on instinct alone, kid. Every technique you'll ever learn worth learning starts with actually understanding what you're doing and why it works, not just mimicking hand seals until something happens. Naruto eyed the dense text with visible dread. I'm not exactly great at the reading and sitting still part. Ask literally anyone from the academy. I'm not asking anyone from the academy. I'm asking you, right now, to actually try, because I suspect very strongly that your problem was never an inability to understand this material. It was nobody ever bothering to explain it to you in a way that made sense, combined with nobody expecting anything from you in the first place, which makes it very easy to stop trying. Renji tapped the scroll. Chakra theory. Basic elemental affinities. How the body's chakra network actually functions, and why control matters as much as raw power. Read it. Ask me questions if something doesn't make sense. I promise you, this is more interesting than whatever busywork the academy handed you. To Naruto's genuine surprise it was. Freed from a classroom full of kids who'd already decided he was hopeless. Freed from instructors who'd stopped bothering to check whether he actually understood the material as long as he wasn't causing trouble. Naruto found himself actually engaging with the dense theory in front of him, asking real questions, working through concepts that had always felt impossibly abstract back in the academy, until Renji's patient, direct explanations made them click into place with startling clarity. Naruto said at one point, staring down at a diagram of chakra pathways with something like genuine fascination. So that's why the control exercises matter so much. It's not just about, holding chakra in your feet. It's about how precisely you can regulate the flow through your whole system. Exactly. Something that might have been approval flickered across Renji's face. You're not stupid, Naruto. Whatever anyone back in your village told you, implicitly or otherwise, you just needed someone willing to actually teach you instead of writing you off. Naruto sat with that for a moment, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest. The particular, quiet satisfaction of being taken seriously, maybe for the first time in his entire life. How long is this gonna take? He asked eventually. The training, I mean. Before I'm actually good. Renji considered the question seriously, weighing his answer with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. Depends what you mean by good. You've got fundamentals to rebuild, control to develop, and reserves of raw talent that, frankly, most shinobi twice your age would kill to have access to. If you're patient, if you actually put in the work every single day without cutting corners. He paused, studying Naruto with an expression that was hard to read. Weeks, to see real, meaningful change. Longer than that to become something genuinely dangerous. This isn't a shortcut, kid. There's no trick I'm going to teach you that skips the hard part. Just discipline, repetition, and time. Naruto nodded slowly, and something settled in him, a decision made not in a single dramatic moment, but in the quiet accumulation of an entire long, exhausting, unexpectedly hopeful day. Okay, he said. Then let's not waste any more time talking about it. Renji allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile at that. The first Naruto had seen from him since waking up in this cabin. Good answer. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we push harder. That night, as Naruto drifted towards sleep, muscles aching in a way that felt strangely satisfying rather than purely painful, his thoughts drifted back, unbidden, to his life in Konoha. Flickers of memory surfacing one after another in the quiet dark. The academy classroom, seats filling up around him while he sat alone, other kids' parents waving from the doorway on days families were invited to watch training exercises, nobody ever waving for him. Birthdays spent at Ichiraku's, alone, the old man and his daughter kind enough to notice, kind enough to slip him something extra, but never quite filling the specific, aching space where a family should have been. The particular loneliness of being the only kid at every gathering nobody quite wanted to include, tolerated more than welcomed, laughed at more than laughed with. He'd spent so many years building an armor out of loud confidence and relentless, stubborn determination, precisely because the alternative, sitting quietly with how much all of that had actually hurt, felt unbearable. But here, in this small cabin in the middle of nowhere, under the guidance of a stranger who'd seen exactly what he was capable of and decided he was worth investing in anyway, something in that old, familiar loneliness was starting, cautiously, to loosen. He thought about Sakura and Sasuke and Kakashi, out there somewhere still searching, still hurting over what had happened. He thought about going back to them eventually, about what that reunion might look like. And for the first time since the bridge, since the fog, since the sound of retreating footsteps that had once felt like the final, devastating confirmation of every fear he'd ever carried, Naruto let himself imagine walking back into that life not as the boy who'd been left behind, but as something else entirely. Someone stronger, someone capable, someone impossible to overlook or dismiss ever again. He fell asleep with that thought held tightly in his chest, and outside the cabin, the forest settled into its own quiet rhythms, indifferent to the transformation quietly taking root within its trees, a transformation that, in just a few short weeks, would send shockwaves through everyone who thought they already knew exactly who Naruto Uzumaki was. They had no idea what was coming. And by the time they found out, this story promises you, it's going to be far too late for anyone to see it as anything less than extraordinary. 2 weeks had passed since Renji pulled Naruto out of that fog-covered forest, and if you'd shown 12-year-old Naruto a picture of himself from that first miserable morning of stance drills, he probably wouldn't have believed it was the same person standing in the clearing now. Not that the change was dramatic yet, not in any way that would have jumped out at a casual observer. He was still a scrawny 12-year-old with unruly blonde hair and whisker-marked cheeks, but something in the way he moved had shifted, tighter, more deliberate, less of the wild, flailing energy that had defined every physical action he'd ever taken back in Konoha. His stance held now, wide and grounded, without Renji having to correct it every 10 seconds. His chakra control had improved to the point where he could hold a steady, consistent flow up the full height of the tallest tree in the clearing without a single wobble. Again, Renji called from across the clearing, watching Naruto run through a taijutsu combination they'd been drilling for the past 3 days. Faster this time, but don't sacrifice the form for speed. If your stance breaks down under speed, it means you haven't actually mastered it yet. Naruto reset, breathing steady despite the sweat already soaking through his shirt from an hour of continuous drills, and ran through the combination again, a 5-strike sequence that flowed from a low block into a rotating series of punches, ending in a controlled sweep that had taken him the better part of a week to stop telegraphing. This time, Renji didn't immediately launch into a list of corrections. He just watched, arms crossed, something unreadable moving behind his weathered expression. That, he said finally, was clean. Naruto straightened, startled by the rare compliment. Wait, really? No notes? One note. Your follow-through on the final sweep drops your guard for half a second longer than it needs to. But that's refinement, not a fundamental flaw. Renji uncrossed his arms, studying Naruto with an intensity that felt different from his usual clinical assessment, something closer to genuine curiosity. Do you understand how fast that is? 2 weeks ago you couldn't hold a basic stance without your knees shaking. Most genin take months to internalize a combination that cleanly. Naruto felt something warm bloom in his chest, the particular, unfamiliar satisfaction of hearing, plainly and without qualification, that he'd done something well. Back in the academy, praise had always come wrapped in exhausted relief, like his instructors were surprised he'd managed anything at all. This was different. This felt earned. Guess I'm just a natural, he said, grinning, some of his old cockiness creeping back in now that his confidence had something real to stand on. Don't get ahead of yourself. But there was no real bite in Renji's words, and if Naruto looked closely, he might have caught the faint, almost there ghost of amusement at the corner of the old man's mouth. Speed of learning isn't the same as mastery. But it does tell me something worth paying attention to. What's that? Renji was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. It tells me the academy didn't just fail to teach you properly. It tells me they failed to notice what they were sitting on. That afternoon, after a grueling session of chakra control exercises that had Naruto standing chest deep in the cold stream, holding a perfectly steady chakra-enhanced grip on a smooth river stone for increasingly long stretches of time, Renji called an early end to physical training and led him back to the cabin for something new. Elemental affinity, Renji said, pulling a small stack of thin paper squares from a drawer. You know what this is? Naruto shook his head. Kakashi-sensei mentioned it once, I think? Something about different chakra natures? 5 basic elemental natures: fire, wind, lightning, earth, water. Every shinobi's chakra leans naturally toward one, sometimes 2, occasionally more in rare cases. Most spend years training to master techniques outside their natural affinity, because working with your nature is dramatically easier than working against it. Renji held up one of the paper squares, thin, unassuming, treated with something that gave it a faint sheen. This is chakra paper. Made from a special tree that reacts to chakra nature. Channel your chakra into it, and it'll tell us what we're working with. Naruto took the offered paper, studying it with genuine curiosity. What happens with each kind? Fire affinity burns it. Wind cuts it in half. Lightning wrinkles it up. Earth turns it to dust. Water makes it damp. Renji settled back, watching closely. Go ahead. Naruto focused, channeling a thin, steady stream of chakra into the paper the way weeks of control drills had taught him to. For a moment, nothing happened, and Naruto felt a flicker of worry that maybe he'd done something wrong. Then, cleanly, decisively, the paper split down the middle, not burned, not torn raggedly, but cut with an almost surgical precision, as though an invisible blade had passed straight through it. Renji went very still. Wind, Naruto said, staring at the 2 neat halves of paper in his hands. That's wind, right? Is that good? That's... Renji picked up one of the halves, examining the clean edge with an expression Naruto had never seen on him before, something between surprise and a kind of quiet, dawning recognition. That's a very clean cut. For a first attempt with unrefined control, most kids barely manage to nick the edges. This is close to what you'd see from someone who's already spent real time training their affinity. So it's good. It's rare, and it's promising, but that's not actually what's got my attention. Renji set the paper down, meeting Naruto's eyes directly. Wind affinity is uncommon on its own. Most shinobi from your generation of Konoha lean fire or earth, historically speaking. But there's something else worth mentioning. The 4th Hokage, the man who sealed the 9 tails into you, his signature technique was built entirely around wind-natured chakra manipulation, refined to a degree that's still talked about as one of the most dangerous techniques ever developed. Naruto's breath caught. Wait. You're saying, I'm not saying anything definitive. Affinity isn't hereditary in any simple, guaranteed way. It's influenced by a lot of factors, and I don't have confirmation of anything about your parentage beyond what you've told me. Renji's tone stayed carefully measured, unwilling to overpromise. But it's an interesting coincidence, if it is one, and combined with what I already suspected about your Uzumaki blood, and the few ninjutsu talent that tends to run in that clan. He trailed off, something calculating moving behind his eyes. What? Naruto pressed. Combined with what? Renji met his gaze, and for the first time since Naruto had woken up in this cabin, something like genuine excitement broke through the old man's carefully guarded composure. Combined with all of that, kid, I think you might have exactly the raw foundation to become something this world hasn't seen in a very long time. Let's pause here for a second, because this is exactly the kind of moment that tends to get glossed over in most stories, and it deserves more than a passing mention. Think about what Naruto's hearing right now. For 12 years he'd been told, sometimes directly, mostly through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small dismissals, that he was hopeless. Dead last. The kid nobody expected anything from. And now, sitting in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, an old hermit with clearly serious shinobi experience was looking at him, and using words like rare and promising and exactly the raw foundation. If you've ever had someone finally see potential in you that you'd stopped believing existed yourself, you know exactly what that does to a person. It doesn't just feel good. It reshapes something fundamental about how you see your own future. So what do we do with it? Naruto asked, leaning forward, all his usual restless energy suddenly channeled into focused, eager attention. The wind thing. Can you teach me? I can teach you the fundamentals of elemental manipulation, yes? Refining wind-natured chakra takes serious discipline, more than what we've been working on so far, honestly. It's not a shortcut to power. If anything, it's another mountain of careful, patient work stacked on top of everything else. Renji held up a hand before Naruto's excitement could run too far ahead of itself. But I want to be clear about something. We're not rushing into flashy techniques because you happen to share an affinity with a legendary shinobi. We build this the same way we've built everything else, slowly, with real fundamentals, or it falls apart the first time it actually matters. Naruto nodded, some of his earlier eagerness tempering into something steadier, more disciplined, a shift that, 2 weeks ago, would have been unimaginable for a kid who'd once tried to master a massive, complicated technique in a single night out of sheer stubbornness rather than strategy. Okay, he said. Slow and careful. Got it. Renji studied him for a moment, something like quiet approval settling into his expression. You've changed already, you know? Even just in 2 weeks. Yeah? Renji stood, moving to put away the remaining chakra paper. 2 weeks ago, you would have demanded I teach you some flashy wind technique right now, tonight, and probably hurt yourself trying to force it before you had the control to handle it safely. Today, you actually listened. Something warm settled in Naruto's chest at that, quieter and steadier than the loud, desperate need for validation that had driven so much of his life back in Konoha. This felt different. This felt like actual growth, witnessed and acknowledged by someone whose opinion he'd genuinely come to respect. I want to be good at this, he said quietly. Not just like flashy good. Actually good. The kind of good that means people can't just leave me behind again because I wasn't strong enough to matter. Renji went still at that, something complicated crossing his features. He didn't respond immediately, and when he finally did, his voice had lost its usual brisk efficiency, replaced by something quieter and more careful. Naruto. He waited until the boy looked up at him. Getting strong enough that people can't dismiss you, that's a good goal, and it's one I can help you reach. But I want you to hear something important, because I don't think anyone's ever actually told you this plainly enough for it to stick. Your worth was never actually about your strength. Not to begin with. The people who overlooked you before were wrong to do it regardless of how strong or weak you were. Getting stronger doesn't fix what was broken about how they treated you. It just makes it harder for people to keep ignoring what was always true. Naruto sat with that for a long moment, something in his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Nobody had ever put it quite like that before, had ever separated his worth from his capability so plainly, so deliberately. Thanks, he said eventually, voice a little rough. For saying that. Someone should have said it a long time ago. Renji's tone had returned to its usual gruffness, but something gentler lingered underneath it. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we start building real wind chakra fundamentals, and I promise you, it's going to make today's training look easy by comparison. Let's check in briefly on Konoha, because while all of this was unfolding in wave, word of what had happened on that bridge had finally made its way back to the village, and the reaction was exactly as heavy as you'd expect. The third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, sat in his office long after the messenger bird carrying Kakashi's preliminary report had departed, the scroll unrolled on his desk, its contents settling over him like a physical weight. Genin Naruto Uzumaki, missing, presumed critically injured or deceased following engagement with hostile forces. Search efforts ongoing, results inconclusive. He'd known this boy since the day he was born, had watched over him from a careful, necessary distance for 12 years, bound by promises made to a man who'd given everything to protect this village and its future. And now that same boy might be gone, in a foreign country, in a mission the Hokage himself had approved despite reservations about its true difficulty level. Irika Yumino found out through the village grapevine before any official announcement, and the reaction, when he burst into the Hokage's office demanding answers, was raw in a way rarely seen from the normally composed academy instructor. You're telling me a C-rank mission somehow turned into a fight against Zabuza Momochi, and nobody thought to send reinforcements? Irika's voice cracked with barely restrained fury and grief. He's 12 years old, Lord Hokage. I'm aware of exactly how old he is, Irika. Sarutobi's voice carried its own heavy exhaustion, the particular weight of a leader forced to make decisions he didn't have the luxury of second-guessing after the fact. Reinforcements have already been dispatched, though the journey will take time they may not have. Beyond that, there is little more I can do from this office beyond trust in Kakashi's judgment, and hope the situation resolves better than the current reports suggest. Hope. Irika's hands curled into fists at his sides. That's it? That's the plan? Sarutobi's gaze, when it lifted to meet Irika's, carried genuine, unguarded grief beneath its careful composure. I have buried a great many people I cared for over the course of my life, Irika. I am not eager to add a 12-year-old boy who has already survived more than any child should have to that list. But I also cannot fabricate resources or knowledge I do not have. We wait. We hope, and if it comes to it, we grieve properly, and we honor what he tried to become despite everything working against him from the day he was born. The words hung heavy in the office, and Irika left without further argument, because there was nothing left to argue against, just the same helpless, aching uncertainty gripping everyone who'd ever cared about the loud, stubborn, relentlessly determined boy currently unaccounted for hundreds of miles away. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly guessed, was that in a hidden clearing deep in the forests of Wave, that same boy was, at that very moment, discovering he might carry more of his father's legacy in his blood than anyone in Konoha had ever bothered to consider. 3 days later, Naruto stood in the clearing at dawn, a single leaf held carefully between 2 fingers, brow furrowed in fierce concentration. Wind-natured chakra manipulation, it turned out, was every bit as demanding as Renji had promised, an entirely different discipline from the raw physical grind of taijutsu or the steady, patient work of tree-walking control. Focus, Renji instructed from nearby, watching closely. Wind manipulation is about precision and direction, not raw force. You're not trying to overpower the leaf. You're trying to cut it, cleanly, using chakra shaped and directed with absolute control. Naruto had spent the better part of 3 days on this single exercise, an intermediate step Renji had improvised between basic elemental affinity and any kind of actual technique, designed specifically to build the fine control that wind manipulation demanded. Channel chakra into a leaf, tried to split it cleanly down the center using nothing but directed chakra pressure, no physical contact at all. He'd failed spectacularly for the first 2 days, leaves crumpling, tearing raggedly, occasionally just falling apart into useless fragments when he pushed too much raw chakra through without the precision to shape it properly. This morning felt different though. Something about the quiet, focused stillness of dawn seemed to help. Or maybe it was simply the accumulated repetition finally clicking into place the way Renji had promised it eventually would, if Naruto stayed patient and kept at it. He closed his eyes, breathing steady, and let the chakra flow, not forcing it, not rushing it, just guiding it the way weeks of control drills had slowly, painstakingly taught his body to do almost instinctively now. The leaf split cleanly in half, drifting apart in the morning air. Naruto's eyes flew open, staring at the two halves floating gently to the ground. I did it. I actually did it. Renji stepped closer, examining the fallen leaf halves with the same careful scrutiny he brought to everything, and this time, when he looked back up at Naruto, there was no careful, measured neutrality in his expression at all, just open, genuine astonishment. 3 days, he said quietly. It took you 3 days to achieve directed elemental cutting with genuine precision. Do you have any idea how long that usually takes someone starting from scratch? Naruto shook his head, still riding the high of his success. Months, typically. For someone with natural aptitude and dedicated training, it's not unreasonable to expect 3 or 4 months before achieving what you just did in 3 days. Renji's voice carried something almost reverent now, the careful, guarded composure he'd maintained since the moment they met finally cracking open into something rawer and more honest. Naruto, I've trained shinobi before. Not many, not recently, but enough to know what genuine talent looks like when I see it. What you're showing me right now isn't just promising. It's the kind of aptitude that comes along once in a generation, if that. Naruto stood very still, absorbing that, something enormous and overwhelming building in his chest. A prodigy, Renji said quietly, almost to himself, studying Naruto like he was seeing him clearly for the first time. That's the word for what I'm looking at right now, isn't it? Uzumaki bloodline. Wind affinity that might trace back to your father's legacy. Chakra reserves that dwarf anything I've encountered outside a tailed beast host. And now, control and aptitude that's outpacing every reasonable expectation I had walking into this. He shook his head slowly, something between disbelief and dawning, serious purpose settling over his weathered features. Whatever your team back in Konoha thought they were leaving behind on that bridge, he said, meeting Naruto's eyes directly, it was never the dead last failure they apparently believed you to be. And by the time this training is done, Naruto Uzumaki, there won't be a single person left in that village capable of making that mistake about you again. The words settled over the clearing like something momentous, and Naruto, 12 years old, standing in a forest hundreds of miles from everything he'd ever known, holding the split halves of a leaf that represented the first real proof of a hidden legacy he was only just beginning to understand, felt something shift permanently inside his chest. Not just hope anymore. Something steadier. Something that felt, for the very first time in his entire life, dangerously close to certainty. He was going to become exactly what Renji had just called him. Whatever it took. However long it took. He was done being the boy left behind. 10 days had passed since the bridge, and Tezuna's house had settled into a strange, heavy rhythm that none of Team 7 would have called normal by any definition. The mission itself hadn't stopped. It couldn't. Gato's grip on the land of waves was too dangerous to simply abandon, and the bridge, half finished, remained both a literal and symbolic lifeline for a village slowly suffocating under a tyrant's economic stranglehold. So Kakashi, Sasuke, and Sakura continued their duties, guarding Tezuna during the day as construction resumed under armed watch, patrolling the perimeter of the house at night, staying alert for any sign that Zabuza and his masked ally intended to finish what they'd started. But underneath the routine of the mission, something else moved through the house like a low, persistent current, the particular, exhausting grief of people who didn't know whether they were actually grieving yet, because they didn't know for certain whether there was anything to grieve. You should eat something, Tsunami said one evening, setting a bowl of rice and grilled fish in front of Sakura, who'd been staring at the same spot on the table for the better part of 20 minutes. I'm not hungry. Sakura's voice came out flat, worn thin from days of carrying a weight she didn't know how to put down. You said that yesterday too? Tsunami's tone was gentle but firm, the particular kindness of someone who'd raised a grieving child of her own and recognized the shape of it easily. Starving yourself won't bring him back, whatever happens. It'll just make you weaker when you need your strength most. Sakura's eyes stung, and she blinked hard against it, embarrassed at how quickly the tears still came, 10 days later, whenever anyone was kind to her about this. It's my fault, she said quietly. I should have fought harder to go back for him. I froze. I did exactly what Kakashi-sensei told me to do, and I didn't argue hard enough, and now you're punishing yourself for following orders during a battle you were 12 years old and terrified in. Tsunami sat down across from her, voice steady. I don't know your friend. I don't know what happened on that bridge beyond what your senseis told us. But I do know that grief likes to find someone to blame, and it's usually easiest to blame yourself, because at least then it feels like something you had control over. Sakura looked up at her, something in her chest cracking slightly at the observation's uncomfortable accuracy. How do you know that? Tsunami's gaze drifted briefly toward the doorway where Inari had disappeared to earlier that evening, a boy who carried his own grief, for his own reasons, in ways that had reshaped nearly everything about who he'd become. Because I've watched this exact thing eat away at someone I love for years now, she said quietly. Grief doesn't care whether the blame actually belongs to you. It just wants somewhere to land. Sakura didn't have a response to that. She just picked up her chopsticks, finally, and ate slowly, silently, while Tsunami sat with her rather than leaving her alone with it. Kakashi, meanwhile, had taken to spending his nights on the roof of Tazuna's house rather than sleeping, ostensibly keeping watch, though everyone in the household understood by now that it was as much about avoiding his own thoughts as it was about genuine tactical necessity. If you've been paying attention to this story, you probably already sense what's really eating at him underneath the calm, composed exterior he's worked so hard to maintain. Kakashi Hatake had lost people before. Lost them in ways that had shaped the entire trajectory of his life, carved deep enough into him that he still, more than a decade later, carried a friend's eye behind his own in quiet, permanent tribute. He knew, better than almost anyone, exactly what it cost to leave a teammate behind in the heat of battle, knew it not as an abstract fear, but as a lived, defining wound that had never fully closed. And now here he was, doing it again. To a 12-year-old boy who reminded him, more than he'd ever admitted out loud to anyone, of the exact kind of stubborn, loud, relentlessly hopeful person he'd once failed to save under nearly identical circumstances. You made the right call, he told himself, for what felt like the 1,000th time in 10 days, staring out at the dark tree line stretching toward the bridge. Staying to retrieve him would have gotten all of you killed. The math was clear. You made the correct tactical decision, but there's a difference between a decision being correct and a decision not costing you anything, and Kakashi understood that difference more intimately than most people ever had to learn. He thought about Obito, about the exact moment decades ago when a different version of this same impossible calculation had gone differently, when staying, instead of retreating, had cost him an eye and nearly his life, but had also meant he hadn't been the one to leave a friend to die alone. This isn't the same, he told himself. Naruto isn't confirmed dead. There's still a chance. But 10 days of searching without a single concrete lead had a way of eroding even carefully maintained hope, and some nights, sitting alone on that roof with nothing but his own thoughts for company, Kakashi wasn't entirely certain he still believed the reassurance he kept repeating to himself. He thought, too, about the report he'd have to file when this mission finally concluded, the official record that would exist forever in Konoha's archives, describing in flat, procedural language the moment he'd chosen to leave a genin under his command behind on a battlefield. He thought about how the third Hokage would read that report, about how Irika, who'd fought so hard for Naruto's inclusion on missions like this in the first place, would react. About how, if the worst was true, he would have to look Naruto's memory in the eye, figuratively, since there might not be a literal grave to visit, and account for the choice he'd made. I should have found another way, he thought, not for the first time, staring into the dark. There's always supposed to be another way. That's the whole point of being the one in command. Below him, unheard, Sasuke stepped quietly out onto the porch, unable to sleep either, and for a while, sensei and student simply existed in parallel silence, each carrying their own private version of the same unbearable weight. Sasuke's guilt, when he finally let himself sit with it fully, took a different shape than either Kakashi's or Sakura's, quieter, more internal, wrapped in layers of a personality that had spent years building careful distance between himself and anything that looked too much like vulnerability. He kept thinking about small things. Naruto's absurd, over-the-top declarations about becoming Hokage someday, delivered with a conviction that had always struck Sasuke as almost embarrassingly earnest. The way Naruto had kept challenging him to spar, over and over, losing every single time in the early days and simply showing up again the next day anyway, refusing to let the losses mean anything except more motivation to try harder. He thought about a moment, weeks ago now, during training before the mission had even started, Naruto, exhausted and frustrated after failing a chakra control exercise for the dozenth time, muttering under his breath about how everyone always expected him to fail anyway, so what did it matter? Sasuke remembered not saying anything in response, remembered thinking, at the time, that it wasn't his responsibility to manage anyone else's insecurities, that he had his own burdens to carry and didn't have room to carry Naruto's too. I could have said something, he thought now, sitting on the porch steps in the cool night air. Could have told him he wasn't actually hopeless. Would it have mattered? Would he have even believed me if I had? He didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure the question even had one worth having anymore, if the worst had actually happened. There's something particularly painful about the specific shape of guilt that comes from small, ordinary unkindnesses, not dramatic betrayals, just the accumulated weight of moments you could have chosen differently and didn't, because kindness felt inconvenient or unnecessary at the time. If you've ever lost someone and found yourself replaying every small interaction you wished you'd handled better, you already understand exactly what was sitting on Sasuke's chest that night, heavier than any physical wound he'd carried on that bridge. You should be asleep, Kakashi said quietly from the roof above, having noticed Sasuke's presence some time ago. Can't. Sasuke didn't look up. Keep thinking about things I should have said to him. Before all this, Kakashi was quiet for a long moment. That's a familiar feeling, he said eventually, voice carrying something rawer than Sasuke had ever heard from him. I've had a lot of practice with it myself, over the years. It doesn't really go away. You just learn to carry it differently. That's not exactly comforting. No, Kakashi agreed. It's not meant to be. It's just honest. He was quiet again for a moment. For what it's worth, Sasuke, Naruto knows, or knew, or will know, whatever tense actually applies here, that you respected him more than you ever let yourself say out loud. People tend to understand that about each other even when it's never spoken directly. Rivals especially. Sasuke didn't respond to that, but something in his shoulders loosened slightly, and for a while, the two of them simply sat together in the dark, each carrying the weight of the same absence in their own private, complicated way. Let's shift our focus now, because while all of this quiet, aching guilt was unfolding in wave, word had finally traveled the long distance back to Konoha, and the reaction there carried its own weight entirely. Hiruzen Sarutobi stood before the village memorial stone on a gray, overcast morning, alone except for the quiet company of his own thoughts. The stone bore the names of shinobi who'd given their lives in service to the village, a solemn, ever-growing record stretching back generations, each name a story of sacrifice the village carried forward as both grief and honor. He'd stood before this stone more times than he cared to count over the course of his long life. He'd added names of former students, former comrades, people he'd loved and outlived in a career that had asked entirely too much sacrifice of entirely too many young people over the decades. He was not ready to add this particular name. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if the reports from Wave changed in the right direction. But he had come here this morning to sit with the possibility anyway, because a leader who refused to prepare for the worst outcome was not a leader who could properly protect the people depending on him, and Hiruzen Sarutobi had spent a lifetime learning that particular, painful lesson. Minato, he thought, gazing at the stone without truly seeing it, thoughts drifting instead toward a young man he'd once mentored, once mourned, once promised to protect the legacy of in ways that felt, this morning, dangerously close to failing. I told you I would look after him. I am trying. I do not know if trying is going to be enough. Behind him, he heard familiar footsteps approaching, and turned to find several of the village elders, members of the civilian and shinobi council both, approaching with expressions that told him exactly what conversation they'd come to have before they said a single word. Lord Hokage. Hamura, one of his longtime advisors, inclined his head in greeting, though his expression carried none of the usual formal warmth. We've reviewed the latest reports from Wave Country, and it has now been 10 days without confirmed sighting or contact, despite extensive search efforts by the remaining team members. Hamura's tone was carefully neutral, the practiced flatness of a man delivering difficult news through official channels. We believe it's time to formally consider the boy killed in action, and to redirect our concern toward ensuring the remaining team members complete the mission and return home safely. Sarutobi felt something tighten in his chest, old and familiar and unwelcome. 10 days is not an unreasonable window for search efforts in dense, unfamiliar terrain, particularly with an active enemy presence complicating the process. With respect, Lord Hokage, 10 days without a single lead, in a region small enough that a thorough search should have turned up something conclusive by now, does suggest an unfavorable outcome. Kohara's voice, when she spoke, carried the same careful neutrality, though something almost sympathetic flickered underneath it. We understand this is a difficult subject given the boy's particular circumstances. But prolonging false hope serves no one, least of all the remaining genin, who need to be able to focus fully on completing their mission rather than continuing an increasingly unlikely search. The boy's particular circumstances. Sarutobi heard clearly, everything unspoken beneath that careful phrasing, the old, persistent discomfort certain members of the council had never fully released regarding exactly what Naruto carried sealed within him, and the quiet, unspoken relief some of them might feel if that particular complication simply resolved itself out in a foreign country, far from the village's direct concern. He did not allow that recognition to show on his face, but something hardened in his chest all the same. I appreciate the council's perspective, he said, voice carrying the particular, controlled weight of authority he rarely needed to invoke so directly. However, I will not be issuing any formal declaration regarding Naruto Uzumaki's status until Kakashi's team has exhausted every reasonable avenue of search, or until we receive confirmation one way or another. This village made a promise to that boy the day he was born, a promise regarding how he would be treated, protected, and valued as a citizen of Konoha, regardless of what he carries within him. I do not intend to abandon that promise the moment it becomes administratively inconvenient to continue believing in it. The elders exchanged a brief, wordless glance, clearly recognizing the futility of pressing the matter further in the face of the Hokage's evident resolve. Of course, Lord Hokage, Hamura said finally, inclining his head. We simply wished to ensure the council's perspective was considered. It has been considered, Sarutobi said, turning back toward the memorial stone as the elders departed, leaving him once again alone with his thoughts and his grief and his stubborn, unwavering refusal to give up on a boy who had already survived more than anyone should ever have to survive. 10 more days, he decided silently, watching gray clouds shift slowly overhead. If there's no word in 10 more days, we revisit this conversation. But not before then. If you've made it this far into the story, you're probably wondering, where's the hope in all of this? Where's the turn? Trust me, we're getting there. Because unbeknownst to anyone grieving in Konoha or Wave right now, someone else was about to enter this story at exactly the right moment, and everything was about to change. Roughly 200 kilometers from the land of waves, in a modest port town known mostly for its fishing trade and, less officially, for an unusually reliable network of informants who traded in gossip, rumor, and the occasional genuinely useful piece of intelligence, a tall, white-haired man with an enormous scroll strapped to his back sat in a quiet corner of a tea house, listening far more closely than he appeared to be to the conversation happening at a nearby table. Jiraiya of the Sannin had many reasons for traveling through this particular region, reasons that varied, depending on who was asking and how honest he felt like being about his actual research methods. Officially, he was gathering material for his next novel. Unofficially, he maintained an extensive, informal network of contacts across several countries, feeding him information that occasionally proved far more valuable to Konoha's intelligence efforts than his flashier reputation as a novelist might suggest. It was through this network, in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, that a piece of information reached him that made him go suddenly, completely still. Terrible business, really, one of the local merchants was saying to his companion, voice carrying easily across the quiet tea house. Heard it from a trader who does regular business over in Wave. Whole villages on edge, Gato's men causing trouble, and word is a Leaf team got tangled up with the demon of the hidden mist over there. One of the genin went missing. Presumed dead, from what I hear. Some blonde kid, whiskered face, real distinctive looking. Jiraiya's cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Blonde. Whiskered. Genin. There weren't many kids in the world who matched that particular description, and exactly one of them held enough personal significance to Jiraiya that the words landed like a physical blow. He set his cup down carefully, forcing his expression to remain neutral despite the sudden, sharp spike of alarm cutting through him. He listened for a few more minutes, gathering what additional fragments of information he could from the merchant's second-hand account, the location, the rough timeline, the involvement of Kakashi's team, before rising smoothly from his seat and making his way outside, mind already racing through everything he knew and everything he didn't. Minato's kid. The thought hit him with the particular, specific weight of a promise made long ago, to a student he'd loved like family, regarding a boy he'd unforgivably kept his distance from for far too many years already, telling himself there would be time later to properly step into the role he owed that child. Missing. Presumed dead. He thought about every excuse he'd made to himself over the years for staying away, the ongoing intelligence work, the sensitive nature of his information network, the belief that Naruto was better served by a stable, structured life in the village than by the chaotic, itinerant existence Jiraiya himself led. He thought about how easily, how carelessly, he'd let years pass without ever properly checking in on the son of the man who'd meant more to him than almost anyone else in his long, complicated life. Presumed. Not confirmed. He held on to that distinction like a lifeline, because if you've ever refused to believe the worst about someone you loved until you'd seen proof with your own eyes, you understand exactly the stubborn, desperate hope driving Jiraiya's next decision. That kid doesn't die that easily, he muttered under his breath, adjusting the massive scroll on his back and turning his steps decisively toward the road leading to Wave Country. Not Minato's son, not after everything the universe has already put him through. He didn't know, walking swiftly through the gathering afternoon light, exactly what he'd find when he arrived. He didn't know about the fog-covered bridge, or the retreat that had left a 12-year-old boy alone and bleeding, or the reclusive hermit who'd found him first and was, at this very moment, unknowingly reshaping the entire trajectory of the boy's future. But he knew, with the particular certainty of a man who'd carried guilt and unfinished obligation for far too many years already, that he was done making excuses for his own absence. Whatever waited for him in Wave, he intended to find it, and to finally, properly, honor the promise he'd let slide for entirely too long. Somewhere ahead of him, in a hidden clearing surrounded by tall trees, a boy who carried more of his father's legacy than either of them yet realized was, at that very moment, splitting leaves clean in half with wind-natured chakra precision that would have made his father proud. Neither of them had any idea how close they were about to come to finding each other. And trust me, when it happens, it's going to change absolutely everything about the story we've been telling you so far. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been since the bridge, since the fog, since the sound of retreating footsteps that had once felt like the end of everything. If you'd asked Naruto, back on that first miserable morning of stance drills, whether he'd believed 3 weeks could change a person this much, he probably would have laughed at you. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was too busy training. The morning had started like most mornings did now, before dawn, cold air biting at his lungs, Renji's voice cutting through the quiet with the same relentless expectation it always carried. But something had shifted in the rhythm of their sessions over the past week, subtle but unmistakable. Renji had stopped correcting the basics almost entirely. Now the sessions moved faster, harder, layering new techniques on top of a foundation that had gone from shaky to genuinely solid. Again, Renji called, watching Naruto run through a combination that blended taijutsu with small, controlled bursts of wind-natured chakra along his strikes. Nothing flashy yet, nothing close to a real technique, just enough directed chakra pressure behind each punch to add measurable force without sacrificing the clean form underneath it. Naruto reset, breathing controlled despite the exertion, and ran the combination again. This time, the final strike connected with the training post hard enough to splinter the outer bark, a small but visible testament to weeks of compounding progress. Renji studied the damage with something that had, by now, become a familiar expression, careful, measured approval that never quite tipped over into open praise, because he made it clear early on that overconfidence was as dangerous as underconfidence for a kid with Naruto's kind of raw potential. Better, he said. You're starting to actually integrate the chakra shaping into your strikes instead of treating them as two separate things happening at the same time. That's real progress. Naruto grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. Told you I was a fast learner. You're a fast learner with 3 weeks of intensive, focused training behind you and nothing else competing for your attention. Don't confuse that with some kind of magic natural gift that means you get to skip the work going forward. But even as he said it, there was no real bite in Renji's tone. If anything, something almost like genuine warmth had crept into the way he spoke to Naruto over these past weeks. The careful distance of a stranger slowly giving way to something that looked, more and more, like real investment in the kid's well-being. If you've been watching this story closely, you've probably noticed that shift too. It's easy to miss when you're moving fast through a training montage, but go back and rewatch Chapter 2 sometime. Listen to how flat and guarded Renji sounds compared to now. Something in this old hermit, who told Naruto flat out that he'd spent 30 years alone because he was tired of watching things he cared about get destroyed, had started caring about something again. And that, as much as any technique or bloodline talent, is about to matter a great deal. They broke for a mid-morning meal, grilled fish and rice, the same simple fare Naruto had eaten every day for 3 weeks now, though he'd stopped minding the repetition somewhere around the second week, too focused on training to care much about variety. They were halfway through eating when Renji went suddenly, completely still, head tilting slightly toward the tree line at the edge of the clearing. Naruto noticed immediately. 3 weeks of training under Renji's relentless attention to detail had sharpened his own instincts considerably, and the change in the old man's posture registered before Naruto consciously understood why. "What is it?" he asked quietly, setting down his bowl. "Movement. Multiple sources, moving fast, not trying particularly hard to be quiet about it." Renji's voice had dropped into something low and controlled, the same flat efficiency Naruto remembered from their very first conversation, back when he'd still been mostly a stranger. "Get behind me." "What?" "No way I can help, Naruto." Renji's tone cut through the protest with absolute finality. "I don't yet know what we're dealing with. Get behind me until I do." Naruto's jaw tightened, old instincts warring with 3 weeks of learning to trust this man's judgment. He fell back half a step, close enough to act if needed, but deferring to Renji's assessment for now. The sound grew closer, branches snapping, heavy footsteps moving without much concern for stealth, the particular careless noise of people who either didn't expect resistance, or simply didn't care whether they were heard. A moment later, 4 figures broke through the tree line into the clearing, and Naruto's stomach tightened with immediate recognition, even though he'd never seen these particular faces before. Rough men, armed with an assortment of blades and blunt weapons, wearing the kind of mismatched, functional gear that marked hired muscle rather than trained shinobi. But it was the symbol stitched crudely onto their jackets, a simple, ugly mark Naruto had seen once before, painted on crates being unloaded near the bridge, that told him exactly who these men worked for. Gato's men. Well. The one in front, broad-shouldered with a scar cutting across one eyebrow, grinned unpleasantly as he took in the scene. "Heard rumors somebody was squatting out this way. Boss wants this whole stretch of forest cleared for a new supply route, and here you two are, sitting right in the middle of it." "This land isn't Gato's to clear," Renji said, voice flat and unbothered, though Naruto could feel the coiled tension underneath his mentor's calm exterior. "You'd do well to turn around and leave the way you came." The scarred man laughed, glancing back at his companions. "Old man's got some nerve." "You know who you're talking to?" "I know exactly who I'm talking to. Hired thugs working for a man who's currently strangling an entire country's economy for personal profit. Sent out here to intimidate an old hermit and a kid because your boss can't be bothered to handle his own problems directly." Renji's tone stayed level, almost bored, but something sharp glinted behind his eyes. "I'd suggest reconsidering your employment, but that's your business, not mine. My business is making sure you leave this clearing without causing trouble." The scarred man's grin faded into something colder. "Cute speech, old man. Boys, teach him some manners." What happened next unfolded fast enough that if you blinked, you might have missed it, which is exactly the kind of moment that separates real combat from the training montages that build toward it. 2 of the 4 men lunged forward, blades drawn, moving with the crude, aggressive confidence of men used to intimidating civilians rather than fighting trained shinobi. Renji moved to meet them, and in the space of maybe 3 seconds both men were on the ground, disarmed and groaning, taken down with an economy of motion that made the fight look almost lazy. But the remaining 2 men, seeing their companions fall so quickly, split their attention, one continuing toward Renji, the other pivoting sharply toward Naruto instead, blade raised. Not the old man's only target, are you, kid? The third thug snarled, closing the distance fast. For the first time in 3 weeks, Naruto found himself facing a real, live opponent with genuine intent to hurt him. Not a training exercise, not a controlled drill, but an actual fight with actual stakes. Here's the thing about training, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Everything Renji had drilled into Naruto over the past 3 weeks had been building toward exactly this moment, whether either of them had planned it that way or not. The stance work, the chakra control, the taijutsu combinations run over and over until they stopped feeling like separate movements and started feeling like a single, integrated instinct. Naruto's body moved before his conscious mind had fully caught up, dropping into the wide, grounded stance that had once felt so foreign and now felt like the only way to stand at all. The thug's blade came down in a heavy overhead strike, and Naruto sidestepped, clean, controlled, none of the wild, desperate flailing that had defined his old fighting style, redirecting the man's momentum with a sharp block that sent the blade skittering wide. The counter came fast, a rotating strike through the hips exactly the way Renji had drilled into him for weeks, connecting solidly with the thug's exposed ribs. The man staggered back, wheezing, clearly not expecting a 12-year-old to hit that hard. What the thug recovered, swinging again, wilder this time, anger overtaking whatever caution he'd started with. Naruto ducked under the swing and drove a chakra-enhanced palm strike into the man's chest, the same technique he'd been refining that very morning, and this time the impact sent the thug sprawling backward onto the ground, the wind driven fully out of him. For a moment, standing over the fallen man, breathing hard but steady, Naruto felt something powerful settle in his chest, the first real, undeniable proof that 3 weeks of grueling training had actually translated into something he could rely on when it mattered. But the moment didn't last. Because behind him, Renji had just finished dispatching the fourth man, and the scarred leader, seeing all 3 of his companions down, made a desperate, furious decision that changed the entire shape of the fight. "You little brat," he snarled, abandoning his engagement with Renji entirely and lunging directly toward Naruto instead, blade raised high, moving with the kind of reckless, all-in aggression of a man who'd stopped calculating and started simply reacting. Naruto saw it coming, barely, a fraction of a second too late to fully evade, and threw himself sideways, the blade catching his shoulder instead of his chest, a deep, ugly gash that sent white-hot pain lancing through his entire arm. And here's where things took a turn that neither Naruto nor Renji had fully prepared for, because pain and fear have a way of pulling at things buried deep inside a person, and what was buried inside Naruto was not something an ordinary 12-year-old carried. Something hot and wrong surged up from somewhere deep in his chest, chakra, but not his own chakra, thick and heavy and red-tinged, bleeding out through the wound and across his skin in faint, flickering patterns that hadn't been there a moment before. The pain in his shoulder dulled almost instantly, replaced by something sharper and more dangerous, a furious, animal urge to make the man who'd hurt him pay for it, immediately, without restraint. "Naruto!" Renji's voice cut through the haze, sharp with real alarm. "Pull it back." Now, Naruto barely heard him. The scarred man, seeing the strange red chakra flickering around the boy he just wounded, took an instinctive step back, fear finally cracking through his earlier bravado. "What the hell is?" Naruto lunged, faster than he had any right to move, and the strike that connected with the man's chest sent him flying backward into a tree hard enough to crack the trunk, the impact leaving him crumpled and unconscious at its base. For a moment, the clearing went silent except for Naruto's ragged, uneven breathing, red chakra still flickering faintly around him, eyes carrying a sharp, feral edge that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "Naruto." Renji's voice was steady now, deliberately calm, the voice of a man who understood exactly how dangerous this moment could become if handled wrong. He moved slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. "I need you to breathe. Focus on my voice, not on the chakra. Pull it back inside yourself." It took several long, tense seconds, Naruto's chest heaving, red chakra flickering unevenly around him like flame caught in an inconsistent wind, before something in his expression finally cracked, the sharp, feral edge receding as awareness flooded back into his eyes. "RNG?" His voice came out shaky, uncertain, the chakra fading rapidly now that his focus had shifted away from the fight. What just happened? I feel, he swayed, sudden exhaustion crashing over him, and Renji closed the remaining distance fast, catching him before he could collapse fully to the ground. You're all right, Renji said, voice low and steady, guiding Naruto down to sit against the base of a tree. You're safe. Whatever happened just now, it's past. Naruto looked down at his shoulder, wound already closing at a rate that shouldn't have been physically possible, the ragged gash knitting itself back together in real time. That's not normal, is it? That's the fox. That's the fox's chakra. Yes. Renji didn't dance around the truth, didn't try to soften it into something more comfortable. That's exactly what that was. Naruto's hands were shaking, and it wasn't entirely from exhaustion. I could have killed him. That guy. I hit him and I didn't even think about pulling back. I just wanted him to hurt as much as Naruto. Renji's voice cut through the spiraling panic with firm, deliberate calm. Look at me, Naruto did, eyes wide and frightened in a way that Renji hadn't seen since that very first night in the cabin. What happened just now was your body's instinctive response to serious injury, an immediate threat, drawing on a source of chakra you have very little practiced control over yet. That's not a moral failing. That's an unaddressed gap in your training, and it's one we're going to fix, starting today. Renji's tone stayed level, entirely without judgment, the same careful, clinical steadiness he brought to every difficult conversation since the day they met. You are not dangerous because of what's sealed inside you. You're dangerous right now because nobody has ever properly taught you how to manage what's sealed inside you. There's a significant difference, and I need you to understand that difference clearly, because the alternative is spending the rest of your life afraid of yourself, and that's not a life worth living. Something in Naruto's chest loosened slightly at that, the sharp edge of panic dulling into something more manageable. You're not scared of me? Or disgusted or whatever? I watched a boy defend himself against an armed attacker who just cut him open, and his body reached for the only additional resource it had access to in that moment. That's not disgusting, Naruto. That's survival instinct, and it's something we can refine into something safer and more controlled with the right training. Renji met his eyes directly, absolute conviction behind every word. What would concern me is if you'd used that power carelessly, without any awareness or remorse afterward. The fact that you're sitting here right now, shaking, worried about what almost happened, that tells me exactly who you actually are underneath all of this. And it's not someone I need to be afraid of. Naruto sat with that for a long moment, breathing gradually steadying, the last traces of red chakra fully receded now, leaving him simply exhausted and shaken in the aftermath. How do I stop it from happening again? He asked quietly. Next time I get hurt, or scared, or angry, how do I make sure I don't just lose control like that? The same way we've approached everything else. Renji's voice carried something almost gentle now, underneath its usual practical steadiness. Discipline. Understanding. Deliberate, careful practice, specifically focused on recognizing that pull before it takes hold, rather than reacting to it after the fact. It's not going to be easy, and it's not something we fix in a single conversation, but it's absolutely something we can address together, the same way we've addressed everything else you walked in here not knowing how to do. For the first time since the fight had ended, something like genuine relief crossed Naruto's exhausted features. Okay, he said quietly. Then let's add that to the list. News of the fight traveled through Wave's small, tight-knit community faster than either Naruto or Renji expected, and by the following morning, something had shifted in how the locals treated the reclusive hermit and his young companion. It started small, a fisherman who'd once quietly warned Renji about Gato's men scouting the area now nodding respectfully whenever their paths crossed at the edge of the market. A shopkeeper who'd previously kept a wary distance now offering a genuine, warm smile as Naruto passed by picking up supplies. But it was Inari, Tezuna's grandson, a boy Naruto hadn't yet met in this altered timeline, though the two of them existed only a short distance apart without either fully realizing it, whose reaction carried the most weight, because it was Inari's own family who first put together exactly who the strange blonde boy training in the woods actually was. Grandpa, Inari said one evening, having overheard fragments of adult conversation about the fight in the forest. About a blonde genin boy with whisker-marked cheeks who'd single-handedly taken down one of Gato's thugs. Is that the missing kid? The one from the Leaf team? The one everyone thought was. I don't know for certain, Tazuna said carefully, though something hopeful had crept into his weathered features. But it sounds like exactly the kind of thing worth looking into. That same evening, word reached Tazuna's house through a different fisherman entirely, one who'd actually witnessed the fight from a distance, close enough to confirm the boy's distinctive whisker markings and unmistakably orange-accented clothing beneath the more practical training gear Renji had provided him. Sakura heard the news first, and for a moment, standing frozen in the kitchen doorway, she genuinely couldn't process what she was hearing. He's alive, she whispered, hands trembling. Naruto's alive? That's what's being said, Tsunami confirmed carefully, watching the girl's face carefully. Someone in the forest, matching his description, fighting off some of Gato's men. Nobody's confirmed it directly yet, but Sakura didn't wait for her to finish. She was already moving, calling for Kakashi and Sasuke with a raw, desperate urgency that brought both of them running within seconds. If you've been holding your breath through the last 5 chapters wondering when this exact moment was going to arrive, well, here it is. But don't get too comfortable yet, because reunions in stories like this one are rarely as simple as they first appear, and this one's got a few more complications waiting before it fully resolves. Let's shift focus one final time, because while all of this was unfolding, the fight, the Fox Chakra, the first real crack of hope reaching Team 7, someone else was closing in on Wave Country fast, driven by his own urgent need to confirm what he desperately hoped was true. Jiraiya had traveled hard for the better part of 3 days, pushing through terrain and covering distance at a pace that would have exhausted a lesser shinobi, driven by a mixture of guilt and stubborn, desperate hope that hadn't let up since the moment he'd first heard the rumor in that quiet tea house. He crossed into the outer edges of Wave Country's forested border just as evening light began stretching long shadows across the landscape, senses sharpened by years of careful, practiced awareness, scanning the environment out of pure habit as much as active concern. And then he felt it. He stopped mid-stride, breath catching in his throat, every instinct in his body suddenly, completely focused on a single point somewhere deep within the forest ahead of him, a chakra signature so distinctly, unmistakably familiar that for a moment, he genuinely wondered if exhaustion was playing tricks on his senses. Dense. Layered. Carrying the unmistakable, resonant weight of a tailed beast seal beneath something else entirely, something that felt, impossibly, like Minato's own chakra signature echoing faintly underneath it, refracted through blood and years and a legacy Jiraiya himself had failed to properly honor. No way, he breathed, standing perfectly still in the gathering dusk, heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to disbelief giving way to overwhelming, desperate hope. There's no way that's. But he already knew. Some part of him had known the moment he'd first heard the rumor in that tea house, had known it with the kind of deep, instinctive certainty that came from decades of carrying guilt over a promise he'd let slide for entirely too long. Naruto was alive. And whatever had happened to him out here in these woods over the past 3 weeks, the chakra signature currently radiating from somewhere deep in this forest was nothing close to what Jiraiya remembered from his brief, distant glimpses of the boy back in Konoha. "All right, kid," he murmured, adjusting the massive scroll on his back and breaking into a dead run toward the source of that unmistakable chakra. Years of careful distance finally, completely abandoned. "Let's see exactly what you've turned into while I wasn't paying attention." Behind him, the last light of day faded fully into dusk, and ahead of him, in a clearing where a boy had just discovered both the depths of a dangerous inherited power and the beginning of real mastery over it, an old hermit and his student had no idea that the next visitor to arrive in their quiet corner of the forest was about to be entirely unlike anything they'd encountered so far.